Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Today, we're very excited to welcome to the program a retired fish and wildlife biologist with over 50 years of experience. He's also a retired University of Calgary adjunct professor on those things. And we're talking about the potential environmental impact of the UCP's new wide open policy on coal mining. Very excited to welcome to the program today, Lorne Fitch. Lorne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, Nat.
So to get started, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of who you are and what's the depth and breadth of your experience. What makes you qualified to speak on these issues? Because that's one of the things we seem to struggle with conversations of this nature. Everybody raises their hand and goes, "Well, I have an opinion," but there's some people who actually have opinions that are backed by years of experience in science. So who is Lorne Fitch?
Well, I'm a person, as you say, with 50 plus years of experience as a professional biologist. My experience with coal started in 1972 when I was sent out to do a biological inventory of a small stream, a tributary to the Panther River in the upper Red Deer River watershed, subject to coal exploration. And there was concern that the coal exploration trails might be causing harm to the bull trout population in this small stream. And so I undertook a biological survey of the stream to understand what the impact of those exploration trails might have been and could be in the future. So that began it. I also looked at, or I was given the opportunity to look at other exploration trails in that watershed. And so I documented the erosion from those exploration trails into not only the Dog Rib Creek, the small stream with a bull trout population, but streams like the Dormer and Panther Rivers. So I also, when I transferred into southern Alberta, one of the first things I was tasked with was a biological survey of the fisheries resources of the Crow's Nest River watershed. So the Crow's Nest River and all of its tributaries, which included tributaries like Gold Creek and Blairmore Creek, which flow off the flanks of Grassy Mountain. The inventories of East Crow's Nest Creek and Crow's Nest Creek that flowed off the flanks of Tent Mountain, the existing coal strip mine of that time. And so that gave me a grounding in what some of the impacts on the physical habitat of those streams had been and continued to be from coal mining activity. I also monitored water quality in those streams, particularly in the streams flowing off of Tent Mountain, because there was a coal haul road coming from that, and subsequent erosion on a regular basis into those streams. I also monitored water quality in Racehorse Creek, which at that time had a heritage or a legacy coal strip mine and a tunnel mine on it. That I also undertook reviews of environmental impact assessments for Plains coal projects. This experience also included, because when the I guess it was the next go around of coal exploration, which was in the first UCP government of Jason Kenney, when essentially the Australian coal companies were invited to come to Alberta, and coal leases were given out like confetti. As you remember, Albertans reared up on their hind legs and said no to coal. And that created, I think, some consternation on the part of the UCP government. And then Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, decided that she had to put a moratorium on coal based on the adverse public opinion. What she also did was convene the Coal Policy review committee, an arm's length, objective group of people who spent the next 9 months on arguably the largest public engagement process in Alberta's history on coal, and they came up with policy recommendations. Well, myself and four of my retired colleagues decided that based on our experience, we should provide them the benefit of our experience to help them in their deliberations over the new coal policy. So my four colleagues and I, we recognized that we had experience with every coal mine in the eastern slopes, from the Old Man drainage up to the Coal Branch, over a 50-year span of time. And we documented time after time catastrophic failures in those coal mines, problems with water quality, fish kills. We investigated them. We were often involved in environmental prosecutions. We reviewed remediation or reclamation plans. And so, that added to my experience beyond my own experience in Southern Alberta. I was also involved as an expert witness in the joint review panel, the first go around on the Grassy Mountain coal mine. I've also reviewed for Eco-Justice the expansion plans for the Vista coal mine just south of Hinton. And just of late, I reviewed the consultant's report for Northback, the new renamed coal company, with a coal exploration application for Grassy Mountain, and provided testimony to the Alberta Energy Regulator hearing on that. So I guess if you ask, do I have some experience with coal? Yes.
I'm curious because, I mean, you've just detailed how you've been heavily involved in these projects and in assessing the environmental impact of these projects. There's two things that I want to ask you in regards to that before we get really drilled down into Grassy Mountain. Have you, in your experience in Alberta, ever come across a coal mine that did not have some sort of deleterious environmental impact?
No,
Never, not one.
not one. Not myself or my four colleagues, who collectively we've dealt with every coal mine in the eastern slopes of Alberta. Not one was free of some environmental catastrophe.
And when we say catastrophe, I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of people are maybe vague on, maybe confused on, I'm not sure what the word is the nature of those events. So when we're talking about, in 50 years of observing coal mining in Alberta and assessing coal mining in Alberta and measuring the impact of coal mining in Alberta, of those bad things that happened, how many of them were a result of a failure to adhere to standards, and how many were, like, obviously just spitball the numbers, but how many of them were a result of a failure to adhere to existing standards? How many of them were a result of, oh, we didn't know that was a thing?
Well, first of all, Nate, I think it's important to remember that all of those coal mines and proposed coal mines are situated in topographically challenging areas. You start tinkering with roads and blasting and disposal of cap rock into the valleys, and that immediately creates the opportunity for slides, for serious erosion, even with things like settling ponds. The engineering specs were such that the settling ponds were often overwhelmed, particularly during catastrophic storm events, which unfortunately were not predicted, even though this is something that, a little bit of understanding of meteorological records could have rectified. The erosion because of the siting of roads, and also failure of things like conveyance systems, the transport of coal. often dump tons of coal into watercourses because of some engineering failure. That was coupled with, I think, probably poor design and an inability to understand either topographic constraints or uh, or the impacts of weather events like fast snowmelt or rain on snow or uh, or atmospheric events that dumped multiple inches of rain on a slope in a matter of hours. And that, of course, was also coupled with a lack of regulatory oversight, a sense that once a coal mine had approval, that it was hands off for prosecutions. And so none of the failures were ever properly documented, and put into a file so that if in fact a new coal mine came along, there could be a learning from the past. And I see that today with coal mine proposals like Grassy Mountain. It's essentially the same old 1900s technology being applied, bereft of an understanding or of any monitoring of past events that might provide a glimmer of understanding that it's not if a catastrophe is going to happen, it's when. How big is it going to be and how bad is it going to be? And as a consequence, should we actually countenance a new mine?
I'm curious because you said a couple of things in there that I think I want to see if I can pull some stuff out of. Um, One of the things that we've heard the UCP say, the UCP government say in regards to the Grassy Mountain mine in particular, is that, oh no, there hasn't been a mine approved. This is the exploratory phase. But it sounds like from what you just said there, even if that never gets to like the full blow mine stage, it sounds like what you're saying there, even the exploratory piece can have tremendous environmental consequences. Can you talk about that for a sec?
Sure. To to undertake coal exploration requires roads because they have to get their drilling equipment to a variety of sites. And in the way that they do it, because they want to, drill lots to prove up what the coal resources are, it means that there is a plethora of coal exploration roads that crisscross mountain slopes, often very steep slopes. The these often exceed the linear disturbance thresholds, the number or the length of road per area that we often use as ecologists to define what the impacts will be on water quality, on wildlife populations, and on fish populations. The other issue is that those coal exploration roads remain unreclaimed for years. Um, there's no requirement to even think about any erosion control, for example, until year 5. Well, multiple rainfall and snow melt events happen in those intervening years to the point where by the time reclamation happens, most of the damage is already done. And the sediment that bleeds from those coal exploration trails is already in downstream water bodies impacting trout populations.
I'm sure that if we had Brian Jean and with some other UCP folks kicking around, they would say, "Oh no, but that's not going to happen with Grassy Mine because you see that was already a project, so the roads are already there, so there won't be any disturbance required. They're just going to be doing the drilling. Everything will be fine." What would be your response to that?
Well, first of all, my review of the consultant's report on the coal exploration program, they already indicated that no, there wouldn't be any new roads, but they'd have to blade the existing trails to make it safe for the exploration equipment, the drilling equipment to get to the sites. There are certain safety concerns that are required. Well, the minute you start bulldozing or grading those roads, you create the opportunity for more erosion to happen. And if you don't install any erosion protection, it's going to happen. And in fact, they were uncertain about any erosion protection actually being put into place. And I might add that no monitoring is ever done of these erosion protection features like trenching or putting in culverts or sediment fence. And so as a consequence, there's no information on whether or not it worked. And based on my observations, virtually all of these things fail. It's a matter of not if they fail, but when they fail and how badly the erosion is going to be as a consequence.
So I just want to make sure I understand that correctly. Um, if they go ahead with the exploration of grassy mine, there's still significant disturbance that's going to be required to get the roads up to speed. And even if they do use the standard protective measures, those protective measures are often grossly insufficient. Am I getting that right?
That's right. In fact, they ironically they call them best management practices. And apparently, if you tack the word best on the front, it means something. But in reality, it means it's what they normally do. And what they normally do isn't enough. And I would add that's a requirement just on the public land. They're also going to do exploration on their private land because remember, Grassy Mountain is private land, or a portion of it is. And they had as much as admitted in the last hearing that they've done no restoration of their own exploration footprint. And
And
and apparently gravity still works. That when you do a bunch of disturbance on the upper portion of the mountain and don't do anything to reduce the erosion or even reclaim it after you're done, that will flow downstream, no pun intended, onto public land and into the streams of Gold Creek and Blairmore Creeks.
And I want to just touch on the exploration piece. Are there concerns to be had with the drilling to find out where the coal is, how much coal there is? Are there concerns for how that's managed? Can that have some sort of negative impact on all of those watersheds that we're talking about?
Well, others have pointed out that there could be some risks, hydrologically to seeps and springs and groundwater. I'm not a groundwater expert, but it seems to me that in massive coal exploration drilling projects, you're bound to intercept groundwater at some point or another. And how that's dealt with then becomes an issue because if if it isn't capped correctly, if it's somehow contaminated as a consequence of the drilling process, all of that flows downstream to receiving waters. That in the case of Blairmore and Gold Creeks, both contain West Slope cutthroat trout, the native trout, which are designated now as threatened because so much of their habitat and so many of their populations have been lost.
And I'm just while we're on the topic of the roads and the things, I'm reminded there was recently an incident where there was a company that was giving just logging permissions, and they went ahead and they put a bridge over a creek bed, and that had catastrophic impacts on the fish population there as well as the water quality there, if I'm remembering correctly. So even if you say we've got world-class standards for how these things have to happen, that doesn't mean that those standards are going to be followed to the letter. And very often they're not. And then there's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube at that point. The damage has been done. Am I getting that wrong?
No, you're correct. And I think I've also monitored uh, dozens of kilometers of logging roads that have the same negative impacts on watercourses as coal exploration trails. One of the issues, it's a fundamental issue with coal exploration, is that according to the AER rules, there's really no need for them to do any impact assessments. And as part of normal impact assessments, it should be required to do a cumulative assessment of what all the land use footprint is in that area. As an example, Grassy Mountain, has a linear disturbance footprint of over 4 kilometers per kilometer squared. That is orders of magnitude higher than is recommended to sustain populations of fish or wildlife. But if you don't actually go through the process of doing the additive feature to come up with a cumulative effects assessment, um, you essentially are shrinking the sense of what your footprint is down to a point where it doesn't make sense to actually say that you're having no impact.
What's the I'm curious let's talk about that impact. So, there I am sure that there are some people, maybe who own parent companies, I don't know, who would make the argument, it's just a couple of trout. I don't care. I want the coal. I want the money. What is to your perspective, what's the best case scenario if the UCP government allows the coal mine to move past the exploratory phase, and what's the worst case scenario? If the coal mine has a thing, what's the nightmare scenario? So best case scenario, and I kind of feel like I already know your answer because we talked about the many other projects and never not one has one not had an environmental disaster. So eh, the bar feels low. But what's the best case and worst case scenario if this mine goes ahead?
Yeah, it it's an irony because when I provided testimony at the last AER hearing over the coal exploration application for Grassy Mountain, it seemed like the only questions that the board had were, well, if we approve this, what conditions would we put on it? And the point is, you can't sugarcoat this. The point is, and I provided it in my testimony, is that if you permit this to happen, there will be some catastrophic impact. We know that because Benga, the previous name, when they were going through their coal exploration program, a serious coal spoil failure happened on the flank of Grassy Mountain, dumping sediment into Gold Creek that resulted in a 95% mortality of the cutthroat trout then. That was from a minor bit of coal exploration, but it's not trivial to the cutthroat trout population. So so given that, you have to ask yourself, we have provincially and federally threatened fish species. We also have species like grizzlies that are deemed threatened. Uh, there, when you look at mitigation, and mitigation in some terms is the same thing that cigarette companies use when they put filters on cigarettes to continue the use without actually having a decline in the health risks. Well, that's what a lot of these mitigative techniques are. They're window dressing. It's putting lipstick on a pig, essentially. And so when when conditions are applied, there's this sense that we can continue the rate of our land use, our human land use footprint, and we can erase everything behind it. That's an illusion. And the other thing is that we, to people that they say, what's a few trout? What's a grizzly bear? I'd like to point out to them that, beyond our legal requirement to protect those species and to recover their populations, those species, and particularly trout represent indicators. They are bellwethers. They're the report cards of how well we have managed the watershed. If their presence or distribution or abundance starts to shrink, that's an indictment against our ability to successfully manage our activities in the watershed. And since they indicate and are the gold star of water quality, that should be of concern to us because, ironically, all of us are downstream water drinkers.
I want to go back to something that you said there, because I just want to make sure that I understand it correctly. For people who are unfamiliar with the corporate shell game that's gone on, Hancock Prospecting is the parent company of all of the companies that have been involved by and large with the Grassy Mountain conversation. That's the company that's owned by the Australian billionaire. Um, there have been at least two companies that have been involved in trying to get Grassy Mountain coal mining going. One of them has been Benga. It has been now transitioned to Northback. But what you said there is that when Benga was just doing their exploration, so this is where the rubber meets the road for me. They had a oopsie moment. They had a moment of catastrophic environmental failure where there was a spill, and the number that you said was 95%. Could you just talk about more? Because to me, if the UCP is saying, "Oh no, we're going to make sure that strictest environmental rules, nothing could possibly go wrong. It's just exploration." And we've already had an incident that goes, no, you killed 95% of the fish. Um, why aren't we talking about that? So could you please just talk about that a little bit more for a
Sure.
second?
The the incident happened on the flank of Grassy Mountain in some of the old coal spoil from the original strip mining operations. There was a road through it. There was a rainstorm event. As a consequence of either the traffic or the rainstorm event or both, a lot of that coal spoil slumped into Gold Creek. The Alberta Energy Regulator investigated it, but investigated it weeks after it happened, and concluded that they couldn't come up with an answer as to why it had collapsed. But without traffic up there, one has to speculate, if there had been no traffic, would that spoil pile have collapsed as it did? So you're dealing with unstable slopes that are at the angle of repose. They are subject to chronic erosion even without any traffic on them. And Gold Creek and Blairmore Creek, particularly Gold Creek, a high percentage of the substrate, what should be gravels and cobbles, is actually coal fines, indicating that the spoil continues to flow downstream, following the immutable path of gravity. And so what conditions would you ever be able to put on that would ensure that no subsequent spoil pile failures would occur? Um, I I I am unable to come up with a scenario where you could do it safely without increasing the further risk to the populations of fish in either Gold Creek or Blairmore Creek.
One of the arguments that the UCP have used is, well, yeah, we've got this mine. It's a big mess. Boy, we need to clean it up. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Northback go in there. They're going to do the exploration. They're going to do the mining, and in the process of doing the mining, they're going to do the cleanup. Super good, pinky promise. What's your response to? I mean, given the unintended consequences that you've already listed off today, and given there's always some sort of catastrophic environmental failure, I'm hard pressed to imagine a situation where they could go in and not make things worse. But you're the expert. What's your reaction when they say, no, no, we're going to go do the mining and clean it up?
I think their proposal is analogous to a situation where you might have a small kitchen fire in your house. A pot boils over, and you got a few cupboards scorched. Well, it strikes me that in a situation like that, you wouldn't just push the house into the basement and start over again. Well, that's essentially what they're saying. Their proposal is that, yes, there's an old mine. About 12% of the mountain is impacted by it. And we're going to fix it up by digging a hole that encompasses more than 80% of the mountain. I I don't think by any stretch of the imagination you can follow the logical progression of that.
Is there a way to remediate that site? without doing all of the mining stuffs?
There probably would be. It would be costly. I think there are some ways of stabilizing some of the most unstable slopes, and ensuring that there isn't the risk of a catastrophic landslide as a consequence. But the reality is the longer you leave it, um, some of this stuff will sort itself out in terms of reaching some sort of steady state, either by colonizing of the slopes by vegetation, or the slopes gain some stability just by the fact that they've moved, but they've only moved so far. I don't think that the proposition of increasing the size of the mining on Grassy Mountain is in any way, shape, or form a solution to the existing problem. The other thing I might add too is that the the current amount of spoil, of overburden, does not seem to be adding to the selenium concentration in the stream. In fact, other researchers have looked at selenium concentrations in Blairmore and Gold Creeks, and concentrations are below the threshold of harm to aquatic life. Now, a caveat on that is that, ironically, Benga, when they were preparing their environmental impact assessment for the Joint Review Panel, actually did tissue analysis of selenium in trout from Blairmore and Gold Creek, and found that the concentration is well above the level deemed safe for aquatic life. They hid that in one of the appendices of their environmental impact assessment, and so that never came out in the Joint Review Panel hearing. So it's not that the current situation is stable, or that it won't continue producing as a legacy item selenium that will impact the trout populations, the aquatic environment, and other downstream users. The ability of dealing with that, though, is, I think it's so technically difficult and so costly that there may not be a solution to it, just as there isn't a solution to the spoil piles that contribute orders of magnitude higher concentrations of selenium in the Crow's Nest Creek drainage, or that have been documented in the McLeod River drainage from all of the Coal Branch mines. These are legacy items that we are stuck with for the foreseeable future, probably for centuries. And it should lead us to the conclusion that we don't want to add to them.
I mean, you brought selenium into the conversation, so I'm gonna see if we can spend a little bit of time on that. Selenium has certainly gotten a lot of attention in the conversations since this started up in the public conversations since this started up a couple of years ago. Um, can you talk a little bit about the selenium risks? And again, I'm going to try to bring it back to that worst case scenario of if something catastrophic happens at Grassy Mountain, what's the worst case scenario with selenium in the water supply in southern Alberta? Is it as bad as people are saying it is? Is it worse? Is it, oh, it's fine. Which one is it?
Well, there's unequivocal evidence that selenium is a risk to the aquatic environment. And, fish tissue analysis from the Crow's Nest watershed and from the McLeod River watershed indicate that fish have levels in their bodies higher than is deemed safe for their survival. It also causes genetic abnormalities, and in the passage of time will create situations where the population declines, and that certainly is the result of the monitoring that has been done in the McLeod River drainage. Fish trout populations have declined, and the researchers have pointed to the problem with selenium concentrations there. The other thing too that I would point out, and one of my colleagues has done work on bighorn sheep on some of the reclaimed coal mines in the Coal Branch. and has found that selenium concentrations in the bodies of bighorn sheep are higher than anywhere else in North America. And of course, they're grazing on reclaimed coal spoil piles. And that vegetation is uptaking some of the selenium and it's being transferred to the bighorn sheep. And the point being is that selenium bioaccumulates. It accumulates in greater amounts as it goes up the food chain. And who's at the top of the food chain? It's us. And this is not an area of expertise of mine, but southern Alberta is a food producing area. There's a multi-billion-dollar food processing industry that's developed in southern Alberta. And other people that have expertise in toxicology have pointed out that this is a risk to downstream users, whether it's food production, whether it's livestock production. It may be us as well because of the aspect of bioaccumulation. So it is not a trivial issue.
Okay. Um, with that selenium bioaccumulation, I just want to make sure that I understand it correctly. Because I think that there's, to my understanding of things, there's sort of two major pathways that it's going to become people problems. The first one is, and I think you covered it off very well there, the reality that there are animals that do graze in the areas where the selenium does get into the grass and the things that the berries and the I don't know what mountain goats eat. I'm not a mountain goat, but it is conceivable, please correct me if I'm wrong, that when you take a look at the percentage of Albertans that like to hunt. So somebody wants to go bag themselves a bighorn sheep. If that bighorn sheep has been grazing in some of these areas where there has been selenium leaching into the groundwater, that selenium then accumulates in all of the grass and the berries and the whatnot. Um, the bighorn sheep or the bears or pick your animal of choice, then eat those things, and that increases the amount of selenium that's in them. It's entirely conceivable that a hunter could be in, hunting and bag themselves either a bear or a goat and not have any awareness of how much selenium they're now putting into themselves. Is that right?
I think there's a risk. Yes. Again, I'm not a toxicologist, but I think there's a risk there, and people who are toxicologists have pointed out that bioaccumulation is real. And I would say that, for example, and I'll go to fish rather than bighorn sheep, that some of the mitigation or the reclamation for coal strip mines in the coal branch have been to turn them into trout lakes for put and take fishing. And because of the monitoring of fish flesh in those ponds, it's now recommended by the Alberta government, by the fisheries staff, that they shouldn't be stocked because the bioaccumulation is such that the flesh of those trout is probably not safe for anglers to eat. And so I think that, this is something that it, it needs to be talked about more, because it's not just the impact of a mine in the local area. It's what happens at a watershed scale. And by watershed, it could include something, immense. For example, the selenium that leaches out of the coal mines in the Elk Valley of BC, it is now found 575 kilometers downstream, all the way into Montana, to the consternation of the state of Montana. And so these are things that need to be taken into account. They need to be weighed carefully and objectively. And in answer, it could be that we have to come up with a sense that maybe these things add demonstrably to the risk, and we just shouldn't add to that risk.
How did things get so far. I mean, that's one of the big questions that I think a lot of people are asking themselves. The Grassy Mountain and the other three projects that are now considered advanced projects because ostensibly Brian Jean said so. Um, a lot of Albertans thought we won. We stopped the mines. They're not going to be mining in the eastern slopes. And over the last year, especially the last couple of months, there have been movements and decisions made by the current government to open things up. How did we go from hey, like I think the number I keep hearing is 80% of Albertans have made it clear that they absolutely do not want coal mines in the eastern slopes, which is a much bigger. I think a lot of people think of the eastern slopes as like, oh, it's just Blairmore. And that's not accurate. It runs a massive that descriptor Eastern Slopes runs a massive amount of real estate up the western side of the province. How did we get here? How did we go from 80% of Albertans said we don't want this, don't do this, to oh, let's do this?
Well, I think part of it's rampant boosterism. Part of it is this illusionary sense that coal is some sort of economic salvation for Alberta. I think part of it is the failure to understand its implications based on existing monitoring information from mines that have been in play and still are in play that have created, all these catastrophic problems for water quality and biodiversity and downstream communities. There's a certain institutional blindness to reality. And I think that part of it is that there's this sense that we can mitigate anything, that we have the technological wherewithal to solve these problems. And I hear this from the coal industry. I hear it from some of our politicians that it's just a technological step away from solving the selenium issue. Well, there are ways of reducing selenium in experimental ways at a small scale, but no one, even tech with billions of dollars, have not been able to solve the selenium issue at a mine scale. And even if they could, and that's a big, big if, selenium leaching out of the cap rock, the bedrock that's wasted into stream valleys, may continue to be with us for a long period of time, long past the lifespan of those companies. As an example, there are coal mines in Britain developed by the Romans. And they still, after 1,000+ years, or maybe 2,000+ years now, still spew toxic chemicals into receiving waters. What coal company is going to be around 100 years? And so, this is part of the lunacy of thinking that we can deal with this, and that we can deal with it effectively. We can deal with it at mine scale, and that we won't impose this on downstream water drinkers, on native trout, for the foreseeable future, at considerable expense, and looking at the economics of it, essentially have a mine that lasts maybe 15 to 20 years and then is gone from the scene. This strikes me as a very poor investment. It's short-termism instead of looking at longevity and at the long term. And as for other reasons, I think you and I can speculate for endless periods of time on what drives this, but logic is not one of the aspects that drives this.
The technology piece is fascinating to me because we hear this from the Premier of Alberta, we've heard this from Brian Jean, we've heard this from and it just blows my mind that I'm about to say this, the environment minister, Rebecca Schultz, well, we have the technology. We're just a step away from getting the technology that can make sure that this is never ever a problem again. And my response is sort of twofold. On one hand, cool. I'm pretty sure we're just one step away from me getting a flying car. I still don't have a flying car. Talk to me about the one steps once I have a flying car, please. But the other piece of it is, and I think that this is one of the things that I struggle with the most is, we saw Brian Jean and Rebecca Schultz in the run up to Christmas do their, we're gonna no new coal mines except for probably these ones. And Rebecca Schultz talked about the strength of the AER and Alberta's strong record, environmental record. And I kind of go, wait, what? Because we've seen so many examples where the AAR has not been the arm's length organization that the government purports it to be. Cough, Kevin O'Leary, cough. But the other piece is, it seems like every couple of months we see stories coming out of northern Alberta where I want to be clear, I'm not denigrating or speaking ill of the oil sands or anything like that, but I think we have to, if we're going to have a conversation about this, we have to have a reasonable conversation about this. Every couple of months we see stories coming out of northern Alberta where um, uh, there is a something happens, and that something causes significant environmental impact. There's stories of First Nations who are having unbelievably high rates of cancer because of things that have leached into the water up there. There's documented examples where ponds have leaked into the water, and this is supposed to be the cutting edge of technology in regards to um, the the very, very best of environmental mitigation. And even in the environment of the cutting edge of the very, very best of environmental mitigation, we still have things that happen that are bad. And so I find it somewhat disingenuous for the government to be saying, oh no, we've got it under control with the coal. We've had years of practice with the oil sands. We can't get that right, but trust us with the coal. There's something about that argument that just doesn't land with me. So I'm wondering what's your take on that?
Nate, there are few grand myths perpetrated by the UCP that are as insidious and bereft as evidence as the exceptionalism touted in how we care for the land and water. There's no evidence of that. In fact, there's abundant evidence we're failing on multiple counts on multiple fronts to do that, because in some cases it's gone to self-regulation. And my colleague Kevin Timoney has pointed out multiple failures in the ability of the Alberta Energy Regulator to deal with chemical, saltwater, and oil spills. And so, there's the evidence. We don't need to go any further. And if that's the evidence, and if we're relying on that agency, and I don't want to take away from, there are still some good people working in the AER, but I think they're hamstrung by the organization itself and the fact that they're not an arm's length organization. They need to be beyond arm's length if they're going to be effective. And they can't be effective when we have puppeteers like Brian Jean pulling the strings.
Yeah. And that's another one of the is it really, here's the question that I want to ask. Is it really just a question of we have these lies that we tell ourselves that we just want to believe? We want to believe that we're good stewards of the environment. We want to believe that we have the appropriate technology to make sure nothing bad happens. We want to believe all of this, but it's just not true. I mean, and we want to believe that we have organizations like the AAR that are arm's length. But again, as we've seen with the Grassy Mountain debacle, the government Brian Jean has inserted himself into the conversation, like literally wrote a letter saying, hey, I know that you guys are arm's length and everything, but here's what I think. It's a little bit like, how do we get Albertans to recognize that we have all of these lies that we tell ourselves because we want to believe them to be true, and that perhaps we can make some of those lies closer to the truth, but right now they're just not true?
You're right. We live in a land of myths and fairy tales, and we have faith-based management of resource management and the issues related to resource management. It's a good question. How do we make Albertans more aware of this? Part of the problem is, a large segment of Albertans work for resource companies, and sometimes it's easier to be blind to the issues that you're part of than it is to recognize those issues, acknowledge them, and ask impertinent, if not difficult, questions. So it really relies on all of us to be critical thinkers, to be active questioners, and to not, I'm going to use an expletive here, not to use the constant BS that we're given as the fact that we're such good stewards of the land. There are examples of good stewardship. We could use those examples of good stewardship as a standard or a template for other things. But to a large degree, particularly in resource extractive industries, we are not good stewards. And we do not use the examples of good stewardship because there's less about the environment and more about the economy in the way that those companies operate. And that's a reality. That's where government has a fundamental role. Government should be the protector of Albertans' interests, not the facilitator of industry's interests, which largely has come to pass. And so we as Albertans need to demand that the Alberta government, the politicians, act on behalf of us and make good decisions on behalf of our interests, not the interests of industry, keeping in mind that industry is the economy that keeps the province going. But it does also mean that industry needs to be held to a much higher standard than we currently hold it. And part of that is that, regulators like the Alberta Energy Regulator or the Forest Service or the Public Lands Administration, you name it, have to be given marching orders where they become policemen, not enablers. And I'm not saying that that would cause a collapse in industry. Most of these industries are doing quite well, remarkably. They're doing quite well because it's a situation where it's bereft of a lot of rules, or the rules are winked at. If they were made to comply with the rules, I think we would see a much different perspective. And I suspect these companies would still make the money that they require to keep their shareholders happy. If we don't do that, we will tarnish our reputation. We will end up sacrificing, I think, a lot of the things that Albertans thought were important into the maws of industry. And as a consequence, a lot of people will wake up one day and wonder what happened. And, this becomes, a real issue for advocates like myself to convey messages in ways that we think that the public can absorb, so that they understand the situation, that we're not calling for the demise of the oil and gas industry or the timber industry in Alberta, but we're certainly asking some questions about, couldn't we do it better? Couldn't we do it in a much more sustainable way? Could we do it in a way that these industries are actually responsible and held accountable for things like water quality, for species at risk recovery, for aesthetic things, for maintaining the sort of recreational attributes that Albertans, enjoy, particularly in the eastern slopes, which is slowly sifting through our fingers without that sort of attention.
Would it be better if we, for organizations like the AAR, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anyone who's involved with that organization at the board level right now, but it seems like there's a lot of appointments that happen that are, like, I'll be blunt. The fact that Dave Yeager, who is a Danielle Smith Wild Rose bestie for years, he ran for the Wild Rose, has a voice at the table for the AAR, makes me go, oh, I don't know about that. Um, and it seems to me that the people that should be appointed to these organizations, if politicians did not have a specific agenda that they were pursuing other than the protection of Albertans from industry, you would want to have people who are going to make your lives miserable. Like if I'm going to be the premier of Alberta, I'm never going to be the premier of Alberta for the record, but if I'm going to be the premier of Alberta and I'm going to say I want to see I want to double oil and gas in the province of Alberta. In order for me to have any credibility doing that, I want to put somebody in a role at the AER who is just a pit bull for the environmental protection piece. Because to me, it would seem that's the way that you build credibility. If you put somebody in there who's going to make your life absolutely miserable because they're going to be such staunch advocates for ensuring that these resources are extracted safely and responsibly and with the least amount of detriment to the rest of the province, that to me gives you an incredible amount of credibility. If you appoint a lapdog, or if you bring in your bestie, who's the one who asked you to run for the leader of the Wild Rose that one time, that to me does not do much for your credibility. Am I being Pollyanna, or do you think that there's actually an argument for that?
Well, I think Albertans, maybe naively, think that we have watchdogs. What we have is lapdogs.
Hmm.
And I don't necessarily the conversation about who sits on the board is an interesting one, but I think it also goes back to the guidelines that these regulators have. When you go back to the legislation, there is legislation that we're going to embark on an orderly development of our oil and gas resources. So that sets the stage. The Minerals Act, essentially says that, coal is there to be taken. The Forest Act says trees must be cut. And so when it comes to that, to a degree, the, the people that are in these agencies have their hands tied when it comes to the way things have changed in terms of the public's attitude, in terms of things like species at risk, which are winking out as a consequence of how the legislation is written, to climate change, which is ramping everything up in terms of the stressors on things. And lastly, public expectations, which have changed and are changing, to ask some questions about, is this the right thing to do? And are we doing it in the right way? If that were to happen, I suspect we would have organizations like the AER and the Forest Service and others that would actually see that instead of them being a silo and only operating within the castle walls, that they actually have and could have responsibility and accountability for things other than the orderly development of oil and gas or the cutting of trees or the mining of coal. And that includes, we expect that the eastern slopes, based on the East Slopes policy of the 70s, is important for water. And yet, where in the mandate of the AER or the Forest Service or whatever regulators there are out there, is there a mandate for water? Is there a mandate for species at risk recovery? Is there a mandate for maintaining some aesthetic qualities that might provide us other economic opportunity like tourism? They're not there. And so I think oftentimes it's not the people there, it's not the staff, it's the legislation that is antiquated and requires a significant review in terms of not only today, and today's world, but where we're heading.
Do we need in the province of Alberta, do we need like an Alberta water regulator? I mean, one of the conversations that has been certainly brewing over the last few years is the one of the next great commodities is going to be fresh water. The new president of the United States has made it very, very clear he's got uh, aspirations for acquiring some fresh water. Do we need like an Alberta water regulator, do you think?
But, yes and no. At the risk of creating another silo, uh, which might be as problematic as the silos we already have. It might be the step towards um, revising the legislation that drives what happens today, and creating the opportunity for some better dialogue about what should happen with forestry operations, with mining, with oil and gas, with a variety of things, so that we don't forget that the golden rule, the paramount aspect of the eastern slopes is that's where 80% of our water comes from. And we are consistently failing in our land management and the regulatory aspects to remember that. Even though it's trotted out as a line from time to time, it would be nice if it wasn't just a rhetoric used, that it would actually form policy.
There is, I mean, and this is one of the fascinating things to me where I'm scared of I don't know if you'll have the answer. I'm scared of the answer. There is in Alberta, we do have the Alberta the Water Act. Um, and do you know who the minister is that's responsible for that now? Because if it's Rebecca Schultz or Brian Jean, I think we have a problem.
We, the other issue is we actually have good pieces of legislation, the Water Act, the Land Stewardship Act, as a consequence, which should be used to drive our land and water use planning aspects. Under this government, land use planning has declined to almost a non-event. And one of the ironies is the Coal Policy Review Committee said, no more mining, no more exploration until you get your act together and actually complete all your land use planning, which should define whether or not coal mining or a lot of this stuff should happen, where it should happen, the degree to which it should happen, or if it should happen at all. Well, if you don't use these tools, which have great promise, um, what you're ending up with is whims, political whims. And I worry about that because the people that are subject to these whims or making up these whims do not understand the consequences of their whims.
Is there anything else that you want people to hear? Is there anything else that you want people to know about the environmental stakes that are at play in the Grassy Mountain conversation?
We are at a pivotal point, and if we don't make better decisions, we may irrevocably change the future. And coal mining is one of those things that irrevocably changes the future. And we have to weigh whatever the illusionary economic benefits are against the real environmental, health, and social issues. And I might say economic issues too, because inevitably it seems that we Albertans as taxpayers end up paying for the costs of some of the failure to get corporations to bear. And so these are things that we need to do now. We need to do it in an open environment that we have the opportunity to engage. And I think as well, there has been, and the engagement process over the coal issue is growing, probably, and will grow even larger than the blowback that occurred when they first took off the strictures over coal exploration and mining. And that becomes then a question of, in a democracy, do you listen to the electorate? Do you listen to the concerns that they have? And, over 70% of Albertans, both in the surveys that the Coal Policy Review Committee took on and in current surveys that are ongoing, but perhaps not public yet, that's 70+% of Albertans who say no to coal mining in the Eastern Slopes hasn't changed. Albertans revere the Eastern Slopes. These are our sacred landscapes. We use them for a variety of economic purposes, but they are also part of our souls. And if we keep sacrificing pieces of our soul, what will we be left with as Albertans?
Quite the note to leave it on. Lorne Fitch, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience and I think if there's one thing that has really, I mean, there's a lot that you've said today that's really landed with me. But if there's one thing that's really landed with me, it's that you and your compatriots have followed every single coal mine that's gone through in the last 50 years, and not one has had a not bad thing happen. Like they've all had environmental disasters in one capacity or another, and that's not great.
There's no stellar record, and we have to use that as a backdrop about making decisions about the future.
For sure. Thank you again so much for taking the time to chat today, sir. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nate.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.